So imagine, if you will, and I know you've probably done this many times, so it's not going to be difficult, that you are one of the pygmy natives in the Congo rainforest of Central Africa. I know. You're sitting at the fire with your family and others in your tribe eating your food, and then suddenly you hear some rustling in the forest just like 50 meters away, and everybody goes silent. The footsteps get louder, and suddenly you hear the shuffling through the thick fallen forest foliage on the ground. You hear chopping sounds. They're hacking away at the vines, clearing a path, and suddenly they approach close enough for you to see them just at a distance. They are these tall, powerful looking people with strange clothing that covers most of their bodies. They're holding shiny metal tools and weapons you've never seen before. Suddenly, these people look up and they spot you and your people standing very still, the only movement coming from the smoke emitting from the fire that you are standing by. They speak, but you don't understand. You've never heard these strange words before. And then suddenly, a loud cry comes from one of them, whom you can only assume is their leader, and they start charging towards you. These tall people with metal weapons are not Europeans. These are Africans. Let's have a Geography talk. Hey everybody, I'm your host Barbs, and oh my hoo-ha hee-hee, what have we here? It's a Geography Now t-shirt and this Geography Now mug that I am drinking coffee out of. It works. That you can get at GeographyNow.com. Check out the website. We actually have a lot of new products and designs on our t-shirts or whatever. Get whatever you want on the website. Feel free to support Geography Now. And as I always say, it is not selling out if it's your brand. So in the world of colonialism or empire building or whatever you want to call it, most people, or at least in the West these days, immediately default to European colonialism. Why? Because it is the most recent and contemporary form that we have been exposed to in our textbooks and our history classes. But the thing is, and I'm sure as you're fully aware, Europeans aren't the only people to have ever had power. There have been a lot of powerful people across the entire world. And they definitely weren't the first people to invent the concept of human dominance and subjugation of others. I'm sure many of you can think of other examples throughout history. For example, like the Mongol Empire, second largest empire ever to have been known to exist, extending all the way from the Pacific to the Black Sea. Even Polynesians had thalassocracies, like the Tongan people with the Tonga-Tui Empire. Nobody even knows about that one, but yeah, that even happened. But when the concept and idea of this topic comes up, very rarely do people even think to even question, did Africans ever colonize anything? Well, colonialism is often defined as the practice of domination of a people or area by a foreign state, nation, or peoples. And usually these areas are administered from a metropole or a homeland central territory of authority that the colonials came from. So like for the British Empire, it was Great Britain. For the Mongol Empire, it was Mongolia. So if we take that technical definition, were there ever any moment in African history where people groups got power, went out, dominated other peoples and lands, subjugating them? Did they also impose cultural assimilation, territorial expansion, and oftentimes displacement of native peoples? The answer is yes, but it's a little more nuanced because it looks different from the contemporary form of colonialism that we know today. But in general, yes. It did happen. See, the type of colonialism that most people in the West are familiar with is the seafaring and intercontinental expansion type of colonialism, which also kind of did happen a little bit in Africa. But for the most part, most of the major powers and empires and expansionist movements in Africa were intercontinental. Not all of them, but most of them. There were some instances where Africans actually ventured off the African continent to dominate new lands, but we'll get to that in a bit. So why were overseas colonial or conquest endeavors not so common in many parts of Africa? Well, there are a number of factors, but for one, you have to look at the general geography of Africa. First of all, the majority of the African continent lies on the African tectonic plate. So that means besides the East African rift system, Africa doesn't have a lot of inland fault lines that can play a role in waterways. As you can see, the coast of the African continent is generally very smooth and doesn't have a lot of inlets that provide natural deep water ports and harbors, and especially not on the west and southern coasts of Africa. But here's the caveat. Even if there were a bunch of natural inlets and harbors and deep water ports in the African coastline, much of their coast lies on the vast open Atlantic Ocean with no natural large landmass neighbors. It's just a big, vast, open ocean. I mean, throughout human history, it's always been easier to kind of, venture off and sail to places if you're pretty sure it's only going to be a few hundred kilometers until you reach an inhabitable landmass. But for the entire west and southern coasts of Africa, the distance was just too far and difficult to traverse with the seafaring technology available in those times. This is why most of the known documented social engagement and conflict and trade happened in the Mediterranean or east coast of Africa, because obviously those areas are super close to Europe and Asia. At any given point in northern Africa, you are almost never more than just a few hundred kilometers away from either an island or landmass within either Europe or Asia. And it's the same situation for the Arabian Peninsula on the east coast of Africa, which of course, from there you can just follow the coastal areas, which allow you even easier access to other lands beyond that, like India and Southeast Asia. You can feel more secure by just following the coastline of the continent instead of just going out into vast, empty, unknown ocean. But when you have an entire coast that is situated on a vast open ocean with no known neighbor, it can be kind of daunting and intimidating to go venture out. I mean, it's kind of understandable that many peoples in the west and southern parts of Africa felt uninclined to go out. Many of them weren't completely sure what was out there. Nonetheless, the African continent is pretty freaking huge. You don't always need big, massive bodies of water and seafaring culture to go out and use your power to dominate new lands. Basically, what it comes down to is, do you have power, and how do you mobilize it? And in Africa, you see a very interesting story that follows the same format, just with different tactics. So what are some examples of these African power dynamics that went forth, expanded and dominated new territories and landmasses, and took control? Actually, quite a few of them. But the very first one that people might instinctively point towards would probably be the earliest known example, ancient Egypt. During the period of ancient Egyptian empires, they extended their territories further south following the Nile River and took over Nubia, and in the north by the Nile River Delta, they went further to the east and extended their territorial domain into what is now the Levant of the Middle East, all the way up to what is now considered parts of Turkey. But yeah, many people consider ancient Egypt as the first known documented example of an African power dynamic expanding intercontinental territory. Another example of intercontinental territorial expansion and dominance from an African group, the Aksumite Empire. This actually went on for like over 800 years. It's crazy. They were actually considered one of the four major world powers alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Ruled by ancient Ethiopian kings, they pretty much dominated the entire Horn of Africa and expanded further into the southern Arabian Peninsula into what is now Yemen and everything in between with the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. That is a crucial trading point. You could probably understand how this area got so rich. But yeah, for about 800 years, Ethiopian kings pretty much dominated this whole area and it expanded into the Arabian Peninsula. Otherwise, if we're just going to talk about intercontinental power dynamics that took over vast swaths of land, Africa had a ton of those as well. Probably one of the most well-documented ones being the Mali and the Songhai empires. But it was basically a period in history with peoples that tried to dominate both the Niger and Senegal rivers, two of some of the most important crucial rivers that feed most of West Africa. Both empires took over the most crucial trading routes throughout the Sahara, and both had access to the Atlantic Ocean, which again would play further into trade with the outside world. But during these empire expansions, many people were taken over. They were put into a position of cultural assimilation into the Mali and Songhai empires. Many nomadic and semi-nomadic people groups were taken over. You've probably heard of Mansa Musa, the disputed richest man to have ever existed. If you take in today's inflation rates, maybe he was, but yeah, he was in charge of the Mali Empire. And he didn't become the ruler and he didn't get rich by just sitting there and not expanding his territory, because that's kind of how you had to do things if you're going to be a big shot. Now, when it comes to North Africa, it gets a little bit more complicated and nuanced, because it's kind of like, to what degree can you really claim it was because people came in and dominated? Let me explain. So the two most common North African power structures that tended to expand intercontinentally are usually referenced as the Carthaginian Empire and the Moorish kingdoms. Here's where it gets a little complicated though, because Carthage, which by the way right now is in the country of Tunisia, was a historical region that was, well, it was originally a Phoenician trading port, and then eventually Phoenicians came in and dominated the whole area, and then they pretty much created their whole new empire that rivaled the Roman Empire. Now granted, they did kind of intermix with the local Berber / Amazigh peoples from northern Africa as well. Everybody was mixing in back in those days, but it was originally a Phoenician thing And for those of you who don't know, Phoenicians are originally from the Levant of what is, the Middle Eastern areas like by Lebanon and all that other stuff. But the thing is, they started out their trading port colony in Carthage like 800 BC. And by the time they became an empire, it was like 600 years later. So like they had already established themselves there for like over half a millennia. So at what point can you just attribute them African status? I don't know. What do you think? Can Carthaginians be considered African, or are they just Phoenician peoples that took over and settled and made it their own place? And it's kind of the same thing with the Moorish kingdoms and empires that took over parts of southern Spain and the islands and all that. The great Mosque of Cordoba, which was then, converted into a church and all that, and then the Crusades, all that stuff. Because the Moorish kingdoms were just kind of like an expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate, which the metropole was in Damascus. It wasn't even in Africa. But the Moorish kingdoms were kind of like a mix between Arab and Amazigh North Africans, and then they were told to expand further into what is now southern Spain. So it's like, what do you want to attribute it to? Do you want to attribute it to Africa because they were in Africa, but do you want to attribute it to the Arab world and the Middle East because it was under the Umayyad Caliphate, which originally came from the Arab world that expanded into North Africa? So it was kind of African, but it was like Arabized, expansioned Africa. But whatever the case is, the Moors went into Europe and took over it and colonized it. So it's like you see that power dynamic of North Africans going intercontinentally and dominating it. Whatever you want to label or classify it as. It's a complicated, disputed, fuzzy gray zone when it comes to what do you want to attribute it to. But either way, there's an element of Africa in it. It depends on how you want to look at it, but some people might argue in the most broadest sense, depending on how you want to perceive it. The Great Bantu Migration may kind of be seen as like a preliminary form of a people group expanding outwards and dominating the culture and social landscape of much of sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the ethno-linguistic map of Africa, the vast majority of peoples speak Bantu or Niger-Congo languages that are all related to each other. And you kind of wonder like, wow, how are there so many Bantu peoples? Well, that's because, according to many anthropologists, which they speculate this may have actually been happening around the same time as the Egyptian kingdoms, around the Guinea Gulf area of what is now Western Central Africa. For some reason, Bantu-speaking peoples started to expand east and southwards, all the way to South Africa, the very end of the African continent. And to this day, you can find Bantu-speaking peoples with languages that are actually related to each other, all the way from Southern Africa to as far as Western Africa. And during this time, obviously, when the Bantu peoples were migrating, they stayed and settled in certain areas and became the dominant people groups, usually subjugating, displacing, or getting rid of many native populations, such as many of the peoples in the Congo rainforests. Many of the native Khoisan peoples of southern Africa were displaced or killed off. But the interesting thing is that it's speculated that many of the southern African Bantu languages adopted many of the click sounds that originally came from the native Khoisan peoples. So you can kind of see how they took something and made it their own. I don't know, would that be considered Khoisan appropriation? I have no idea. I'm kidding. Kind of. I don't know. Depends on how you look at it. And speaking of Bantu peoples, you see a very strange social dynamic happening in East Africa. Now, personally, I think one of the most unique and interesting social dynamics in the world are the Malagasy people of Madagascar, because their ancestors originally came from Austronesia in the islands of what are now Indonesia that sailed over and took over Madagascar and then intermixed with native Bantu peoples. So it's like the world's biggest Blasian country, I guess you could say. Nobody knows exactly when or how the Bantu peoples came to Madagascar over the Mozambique Channel. Probably they just built a bunch of canoes and sailed there, but we don't have an exact knowledge of how it happened. But what we do know is that the Austronesians dominated Madagascar. But in that regard, it's also known that there was an Austronesian presence in the islands of Comoros. We know this through things like pottery and introduction of Asian crops like rice and bananas having been around for at least a millennia. But when you go to Comoros, the language is Shikamori, which is a Bantu language, and the people here are predominantly Bantu. But people have done genetic tests that it shows that many Comorians have a slight Austronesian genetic admixture. So that means at some point there probably were Austronesians in Comoros, but then Bantu peoples came in and became the predominant people group, spreading Bantu culture and language. And what did that look like for the ancient Austronesians in Comoros? Were they just absorbed and intermarried with the Bantu peoples, or were they kicked out? We don't exactly quite know. But does that mean that the peoples of ancient Comoros were Bantu peoples that came in knowing that there were Austronesian peoples there and subjugated the areas for themselves, being the stronger power dynamic and becoming the Comoros that we know today? It's kind of hard to say because written documentation didn't exist until the Omani Empire came in and then created the whole Swahili coast thing, which that's a whole other story. That was a Arab, Muslim, Omani thing. That's a whole other story. But yeah, the Comoros Islands, what really happened a long time ago with them? We don't really quite completely know. But what we do know is that it is Bantu. So those are just a few examples of how certain historical African power dynamics played a role when it came to expansionism and sometimes even intercontinental expansionism. It's a very fascinating tale that a lot of people don't seem to look too much into. It was a thing. I don't know, I just thought this was an interesting topic and I kind of wanted to cover it. But yeah, if there was anything I missed or if there was something that you feel like I really should have covered but I didn't, write it in the comments, okay? Teach us. I just find it fascinating how a lot of these stories just kind of get lost in time. Anyway, thank you for watching this. Feel free to subscribe, like, share, whatever. I don't know. That stuff YouTubers say, okay? Hope you have a good one. Stay cool. Stay tuned.